currently writing a book about his experience. He likes to learn and write, and in his spare time he plays Facebook games, but would rather be playing drums. All right, we're kindred spirits. He has 3 young adult children and currently works in hotel management. So please help me welcome Doug Doan.
You heard the one about the dyslexic, agnostic, insomniac. Stayed up all night wondering if there was a dog.
Me.
I want to thank you for inviting me to speak. It's been a little while since I've spoken in a church. I want to thank Carrie for inviting me, and Luke for creating the PowerPoint we're going to use and manning it, and thanks to my friends who came to support me. My peanut gallery is right over here. And what we're going to do tonight is tell a story, and it's going to be my story. And I think that all of our stories have a powerful effect on us. Who we are, what we think, what we believe, what we do comes largely out of the stories that we have lived and experienced. I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about my spiritual pedigree. And by that I mean where I came out of. I would say that I'm a purebred Wesleyan Methodist. Now, most of you, if you're from Jacksonville, have no idea what I'm talking about when I say Wesleyan Methodist. It's a small denomination. It's more popular in the north and the west. It was a split off from the Methodist Church in the early 1900s because they wanted to get back to John Wesley's true teachings, especially about entire sanctification. I won't get into big details about entire sanctification, but basically it's the idea that after you're saved, at some later point, there's another thing that God does, and he cleanses your heart from all inbred sin and allows you to lead a sinless life. Traditionally, this basically led to a lot of legalism, a lot of don'ts, things you can't do. A big influence on my life, spiritually and otherwise, was my mother. Her name is Donna Bell. I've never met another Donna Bell. It's all one word. She died of cancer a few years ago. God rest her soul, and I say that metaphorically. But her father was a Wesleyan minister in Western New York. Her mother had been a traveling musical evangelist in the Appalachian Mountains before she was married. Her sister and husband were medical missionaries to Stone Age tribe people in Papua New Guinea. My mother was a devout believer from the day she was born to the day she died, never had a moment of doubt. When she was young, she had a problem with her knees, and they took her to the doctor and eventually figured out it was because she had spent so much time in prayer as a child. So she was involved in a tremendous number of church activities, mainly teaching and directing things. Once when I burned my finger on the lawnmower muffler, she said, as much as that hurts, imagine how hell will feel for all eternity. She was a comforting type. Her faith was simple and straightforward and bold. We had to wear orange on St. Patrick's Day because that was the Protestant color. There were 3 events that I was involved with throughout my life that she walked out on because she disagreed with the content. My father was kind of a silent partner in parenting, but still had an influence nonetheless. He was a church board member and was on the board of numerous Christian organizations around Syracuse, where we grew up. He loved to volunteer, particularly with his carpentry skills, and he still does today at 78 years old. His faith is simple and practical, and he just simply goes about doing God's work. He doesn't get bogged down in intellectual or theological issues. My parents were founding members of the Kirkville Wesleyan Church, which is a small suburb outside of Syracuse. I looked up Kirkville, New York on Wikipedia, it doesn't even have an entry. They were very deeply involved in the church until they left themselves to do missions work in Haiti for 15 years. As far as other relatives, my father's sister married a minister. My sister married a minister, spent 8 years in Africa, and they're currently pastoring a Wesleyan church in San Diego. And their daughter now does missions work in Bolivia. That's a little bit about the background that I came out of and that I was born into. Now for the long and winding road. And my religious experience over 50 years is hard to package in a small time frame. And yet I'm going to do the very best I can to give you the highlights. I accepted Jesus when I was probably 4 or 5 years old at my mother's instigation. Prayed the sinner's prayer, if you're familiar with what I mean by that. Our home life was thoroughly religious. The books we read, the music we listened to, the radio station, even games with Christian themes. Big emphasis for my spirituality as a child was on what not to do. The cardinal sins were smoking, drinking, swearing. You couldn't even say the cheat words like gosh or darn or heck. Dancing, playing cards, skipping church even on vacation, buying anything on Sunday, even gasoline. Not tithing, working on Sunday, any form of gambling, marrying a non-Christian, divorce, premarital sex. The list went on and on of the things that we were not supposed to do, and if we did, we were putting ourselves in danger with God. The church, of course, was central. Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night prayer meeting, Tuesday night Christian Youth Crusaders, which is the Wesleyan version of Scouts, Bible Club camp in the summer, Vacation Bible School, our Wesleyan district camp called Chambers Camp, which was like a 10-day revival, complete with a white tabernacle, wooden tabernacle with sawdust aisles. It was at that camp, Chambers Camp, that I had an experience which I call Innocence Lost. Several of us boys playing down by the railroad track, usually trying to see if we could derail trains. I know it's not a good thing to say, but that's what we did as kids. But somehow about 4 of us got involved with some sexual activity. This was completely new to me. I had no idea what this was about. All I knew was it felt good. And but afterwards, it left me with a lot of anxiety. Like, what does this mean? How do I interpret this? I didn't feel like there was anybody safe that I could talk to about it. But even at 7 years old, I had enough Bible training and exposure to know that Leviticus talks about a man lying with a man. So it led to questions about my gender orientation and about my salvation as far as how secure I was with God. In the teen years, the end times was a big deal, kind of like it is now. I think it was even more fanatical back then. Jesus was coming soon. Anything that happened with Israel or the Middle East was analyzed endlessly. If I came home and none of my family was there, I worried that the rapture had come and I had been left behind. At 13, I discovered masturbation. Believe me, this is not going to be a talk about sex, but these things are important. I didn't know I didn't know what to do with this either. Again, I felt like there was nobody I could talk to about it, and the Christian teachings that I ran across about it seemed to be very ambiguous about whether it was okay or not. I did think that pornography must be wrong, but Sears catalogs might be okay. I was in a traveling teen singing group that traveled central New York called All God's Children. We sang in small churches on Sunday morning and Sunday evenings. I got very involved in contemporary Christian music, which was at that time a new thing. Christian music that actually sounded like real music, regular music. It was kind of a cool, something that I really took to. I don't know if any of you remember, but back in '76 there was a campaign, a national campaign called I Found It. This is billboards, stickers that said I found it, buttons that said I found it, and it was designed to create curiosity. If somebody would ask, what is this? I found it, and then you would have a chance to tell them you found Jesus and share the gospel with them. At 16, I remember helping my family when we manned the call center during a national TV event, and I would take calls from people who would call in from the TV event, and using a flow chart that was provided, guide the conversation to the point where I would lead them into the sinner's prayer. I got into the creation evolution controversy a little bit. I got a journal from Institute for Creation Research, which was one of the early, before intelligent design time, kind of organizations that promoted creation over evolution. Nobody that I knew of could talk about this intelligently with me. For example, my mother taught a song in Sunday school that at her funeral, several of us got together and sang, and I'll try to give it due justice here. I'm no kin to the monkey's no kin to me. I don't know much about your ancestors, but mine didn't swing from a tree. I went to Word of Life Bible Camp in Scroon Lake, New York, which was a one-month event where I was introduced to the concept of the doctrine of eternal security. This was new to me. It was the basic idea that once you're saved, you're always saved. You can't lose it. There's nothing you can do to lose it. Well, this was dramatically different than anything I had experienced because I was eternally insecure. And, so this was kind of cool for me. Church youth group was kind of nice. We had Mr. and Mrs. Bertrand were in charge of it. They're kind of like hippies, but they were responsible and had chosen to. I became president of the youth group during my senior year. And one thing about teen years was high school. My home and church life didn't seem to collide with my school life very much. They were almost like two separate worlds. But I didn't have the courage in my senior year to put up a plaque inside my locker that said, "Hi, I'm Jesus." Some people, I think, thought that was true. But anyways, that's the limit of my mixing of the two worlds. I went off to Houghton College. My mother had gone to Houghton College. It was a foregone conclusion that I would go there. So a small liberal arts Wesleyan college in Western New York. I immediately stopped going to church, never attended the whole 4 years I was there. Part of my experience during Houghton was a study abroad program in France for 6 months. This was a chance for me to be truly independent with no fear of recrimination. I was out there away from everybody, doing whatever I wanted to do. I picked up smoking and drinking, two of the cardinal sins, and of course all the French youth at that time were big into smoking and drinking, so I was just part of the crowd. Went back to Houghton College after that, lived in outside housing, did a lot of things to break the pledge. Houghton College had a pledge of behavior, things you weren't supposed to do. So again, I was involved in breaking the pledge, smoking, drinking, having women stay over, experimenting with marijuana, that sort of thing. I started in Godspell that year, so I had a chance to be Jesus. My mother, my family came to watch the play, and my mother stayed in the car and wouldn't attend because she chose God's only son over her only son, believing that the play was sacrilegious. I took a lot of psychology courses, including the psychology of religion, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and began to formulate the possibility that a lot of religious experience could be explained psychologically without the need for God. After I graduated from Houghton College, I lived back home. My plans for the future were kind of hazy. I was going to be a French high school teacher, but I learned that I like French more than I like high school students, so I was kind of stuck. Because I lived at home, I had to go to church, and so one day a sermon that the pastor preached struck some kind of chord with me, and something inside of me said, okay, I need to recommit my life to God. I need to go 100% in. The reason my previous life Christian life was so kind of lackluster was because I wasn't completely committed. So I walked from the balcony all the way downstairs and knelt at the front of the altar, and you could say that the prodigal was welcome back home. I immediately became captain of the Bible quiz team, and we studied the book of Matthew. A lot of things I didn't understand about it, and I wanted to understand it better. A friend of mine who had been a drug dealer got saved, and we started a Christian rock band together, played around Central New York. My mother walked out of one of the concerts. I was used to that. My sisters had both been to Bethany Bible College already and were preparing to return in August. I still had no plans for what to do with my life, and I figured it would be great for me to go to Bethany Bible College for 1 year to get some of that biblical foundation that I thought was so necessary if I was going to be 100% committed to God. It's a strict Wesleyan school emphasizing holiness and evangelism and missions. I would say it was hyper-spiritual, like religion on steroids. If you wanted to eat, sleep, breathe, talk, live religion 24/7, this was the place to do it. I realized that if I stayed 2 years, I could get a bachelor's degree in religion, so I ended up staying for 2 years. And in the second year, I was elected ministerial president and led a short-term missions trip, as we called them, to Manchester, New Hampshire, where we tried to convert the Catholics. Didn't work out too well. After the 2 years, I graduated, became a licensed minister in the Wesleyan Church. Upon returning home, I immediately became assistant pastor at the Lynn-Court Wesleyan Church in Syracuse. I liked the chances that I got to preach. I had two main themes. One, you're not good enough Christians, and two, there's a lost world that needs to be saved. So it was kind of some rehashing of those themes most of the time. I came in with guns blazing, and thankfully the pastor and the church were kind, loving, tolerant people, and I kind of had some of my rough edges smoothed off. The pastor, after I was there for 1 year, the senior pastor was elected to district superintendent, so now he was over about 50 churches in central New York, and I took over as the senior pastor. At 27, I was really on the fast track to ministerial success. I had a lot of extracurricular activities that were outside of that particular church. For example, the Billy Graham Crusade came to Syracuse 1 year, and I was appointed to be the captain of the counselors, which is a fancy title, but I felt important about it. I was also involved in the Central New York District Youth quite a bit, and ended up becoming vice president and president of that as well. The District Board of Ministerial Standing wanted to ordain me, wanted me to get ordained, and I resisted it because I didn't feel like I had a call. There was supposed to be some special sense that God had called you to the ministry or called you to be a pastor. And I just never really felt like I had that. I just felt like I was a supercharged Christian, and that's all there was to it, just like anybody else. So I did continue to resist that. I still stayed a licensed minister, which meant I could do anything I needed to do. It wasn't a problem. I had to come up with preaching topics more than just the two that I had as pet topics. So I had to start looking at the Bible and reading through it and studying it. And I came across things that I had problems with. For example, the Wesleyan Church says you have to tithe 10% of your income to the church. I could not find that supported in the Bible. Entire sanctification, the second work of grace that I spoke about earlier, I couldn't really see that supported in the Bible. In fact, the more I studied the Bible, the less clarity I had about what it said. Although I was having much outward success, in my personal life things weren't going so well. I had gained 70 pounds since being at the church. My marriage, I had married a girl from Bible college, and our marriage was pretty rocky. So we went to marriage counseling, and I attended a therapy group for 2 years. This was a breath of fresh air for me. I'd never been in an environment where I could just be free to be me without trying to have to be something. The concept of grace became important to me, and I got off the performance treadmill due to a book that I read called Healing Grace. it was a big change for me. A couple of things that I kind of figured out through counseling. One, I don't think I was built to be a pastor. Second, I don't think that I'm really a good fit for the Wesleyan denomination. So, as traumatic as it would be for a Catholic to leave their faith, or a Jew to leave their faith, somebody that's whole culture is wrapped up in it, I did resign from the church and from the Wesleyan denomination at the same time. I then got a job at the Syracuse Rescue Mission, where I babysat 70 men with addiction issues at night. That was a lot of fun. We did some church shopping. I knew I was going to be Wesleyan, but I didn't know what it was going to be. So I went to a church called Trinity Fellowship, where Jeremy Jackson was the pastor. That was interesting because he was a close associate with Francis Schaeffer, who was a popular Christian apologist back in the 70s. My wife got a little fed up with my wandering career and said, you got to make up your mind, what are you going to do, and do it. Get whatever training you need. So I had really begun to be interested in the integration of psychology and theology, and figured that if I could get a master's degree in counseling, I could make a pretty good Christian counselor. So I went to Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in Boston, which is a multi-denominational seminary, and it's made up of mainline denominations, not fundamentalist churches. So I figured it would be a real broad experience, which I was looking for. I would say that I switched from a doing mode to a knowing mode. I collected 2,000 books, had lots of heady discussions. I did run into some disappointments, though. The school was strictly believing in the inerrancy of Scripture. I really felt like, because it was mainline, multi-denominational seminary, that it would be a little more liberal and tolerant to other views about the Bible, but they were strictly inerrant. They also believed in covenant theology, which says that God's covenant with man has always been the same. It's always been redemption, faith, and works. Well, the part about works really sent me into a tailspin, because I was all about grace at that point, and I didn't want to hear about works. So I actually went into somewhat of depression and went on antidepressants for the first time in my life, which worked pretty well, actually. I also found that the Christian theology textbook that we used in Intro to Theology was, although a fascinating book to read, would present a particular doctrine, say salvation or the atonement or whatever, and it would present several significantly different theories or approaches to what people believed about that particular doctrine. And the thing that bothered me about that was, after 2,000 years, you'd think we would have figured this out by now. All the best minds in Christianity with all the Bible study that you could have and everything, and we still have multiple possible explanations for very important things. So I had a brief affair with the Catholic Church, because they don't necessarily believe that the Bible is the be-all and end-all of answers to the faith. They think the church itself is the guardian or custodian of the Christian faith. However, I realized not too long afterwards that the faith that they guarded changed significantly throughout the years and actually reversed itself many times. So I kind of gave that up and went over to the Episcopal Church, which is kind of like Catholic light. It's got all the liturgy, but none of the guilt. I remember doing a presentation in one of my psychology courses. I must have been pretty depressed at that time, because I did it about the book of Ecclesiastes and how life is meaningless, and related it to existentialism. It was pretty quiet in that class that day. I did graduate magna cum laude, and Billy Graham was the commencement speaker, which I thought was pretty awesome at the time. I got a job immediately with Minirth Meyer New Life Clinics. Minirth and Meyer were two psychiatrists in Texas that were in some of the very beginning of the Christian psychology movement, and so I was honored to work there. Even though I had an uncertain faith based on all these experiences I had in seminary, I still had a great ability to be compassionate with suffering Christians. And I could actually talk to them about medication issues as well, because they were usually afraid of taking medication. I would say I went next into wilderness years. My wife and I had never really settled on a church after seminary, and we just drifted away from the things of God altogether. I had secular jobs in sales and management. But like Mulder on the X-Files, I want to believe. I became interested in psychics and mediums, people that talk to the dead. And I ended up attending a spiritualist church in none other than Salem, Massachusetts, where they gave live readings during the service. They would come to you and say, you know, your grandmother is saying such and such or whatever. I would say I went from a doing mode to a knowing mode, and now I was in an experiential mode. Marriage problems never got fixed, and we ended up being separated and divorced. And for a variety of reasons, we decided to move the family, all of us, down to Jacksonville, Florida. Heard of that? My daughter lost her purse one day. I think she had put it on the hood of the car, or the trunk of the car, and we had driven off. And the purse had fallen by the side of the road. Well, an African-American woman had found it and somehow got our phone number and agreed to meet us in the Winn-Dixie parking lot over there on San Jose. And when we went to meet her there, she started prophesying to us. Basically saying things about us or to us, and using Christian language, which I hadn't experienced before. In the spiritualist church, of course, they don't use so much biblical language, but she was using Christian and biblical language. I remember one of the things she said was, speaking to me, she said, "There's a reason God brought you to Jacksonville. He knows you're a man of integrity like Joseph. He has not forgotten you." Well, so what was I going to do with this experience? She said that she and her husband had a house church, and I decided that me and the children would attend a few times, which we did. It was very loud, boisterous, ecstatic, emotional, and I had an experience which I interpreted as the baptism of the Holy Spirit, and at that point I did have the ability to speak in what was called tongues. I became hyper aware of anything that might be the leading of the Holy Spirit. A thought, a feeling, a hunch, an event, a circumstance, just anything where God might be trying to communicate to me. I prophesied to people at work. I would lay my hands on them and pray for them. I started writing out my prayers in conversational style. I would say something and then God would say something back. Everything went fine at the church until one significant event where the African-American lady who was kind of the church prophet told us one Sunday, told everybody in the congregation, well, about maybe 20 people, to give everything they had in their wallets that day in the offering. And that if we did, that God would repay us double that week. All right? Sounds like a good deal to me. So we did it. Me and my children gave everything that we had. The following Sunday, of course, I was eager to find out how everyone had been blessed. Well, I talked to everyone. No one had had any financial blessing, and one person had lost their job. This did not impress me. And I talked to the pastor. I said, this is just wrong. This is spiritual extortion is what it boils down to. Anyways, for that and other reasons, we decided to go to a different church, and we ended up going to Christ Church in Mandarin, which is a mega church with 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people, something like that, upper middle class. I became involved with a program they have called Celebrate Recovery, and that's where I met somebody who became my best friend, Mark, who is here tonight. Hi, Mark. Mark and I would get on the phone every morning at 7 o'clock and talk and pray together for a long, long time. suddenly I was desperately poor, and I was praying, and I got a call from the guy who had been my boss at North Meyer New Life Clinics, saying that they now had a program where you work out of your house, doing the same work I had done for them before, but now I was doing it out of my house. Calls would be transferred to me. I would be able to transfer them to other places as needed, etc. And eventually they developed a phone counseling program. Well, with my master's degree, I was eligible to be one of the phone counselors. I was eager to give it a try. I felt like with my experience, my training, my charismatic renewal, if you will, that I would be able to really help people. And I did. I received much positive feedback from my clients, and I would usually pray powerfully for them at the end of each session. One of my co-workers, Megan, talked to me from time to time about Messianic Judaism, basically meaning that the Old Testament or the Torah, the law, is still relevant to Christians today, whereas the popular view is that that's all in the past, and that's all law, and now it's all grace and Jesus. But I ended up reading a book that she sent me, a couple of websites that were very helpful. I attended a 14-week video course called Discover Your Foundation, and began to realize there's a lot of support for this notion that the early Christians never stopped practicing the law after Jesus rose from the dead. So the problem with that was, for most of my life, I kind of dismissed most of the Old Testament, so I didn't really look at it too carefully, because it's not that pretty. But this forced me to have to start looking at some of these things in the Old Testament more seriously than I had done before. Well, the next section I call the catalyst for change. I had been on and off of antidepressants since that first time that I mentioned. And I was having some side effects, but we didn't know which medications were causing them. So my doctor said, why don't you go off all your medicine, and then we'll put you back on each one at a time, and that way we'll be able to figure out which medicines is causing the problem. Sounded like a good idea, but about 6 weeks after I went off of medicine, I went into a deep depression. So I went back to the doctor and said, hey, I got to get back on the antidepressants right away. Didn't help. Went to a psychiatrist, kept getting worse. Didn't help. I kept getting more and more depressed. I started to drive recklessly, hoping I would get in an accident. I remember laying in the bathtub one day, crying out loud to God for help. And I was thinking to myself, if God has the ability to help me with this, but he doesn't, it's unforgivable. It wasn't a threat to God or anything. I was just thinking, this would be unforgivable if he didn't help me with this. It was so bad. I went to Christian Healing Ministries, which is an internationally known healing ministry here in Jacksonville, run by Francis McNutt. They broke generational curses, cast out demons, had soaking prayer sessions, met with specially trained counselors for 90 minutes. I was desperate. I was looking for anything that would help me. But it kept getting worse. And one day I specifically remember on the way to work having an impulse to drive off the Buckner Bridge. Speaking of the Buckner Bridge today. Other things that were catalysts, I was having some dilemmas in my counseling practice. There was a wife who was having trouble submitting to a controlling, abusive husband. There was a couple that had a platonic, loveless marriage. There was a woman who couldn't figure out whether she should let a gay couple friend of hers rent a room from her. So, because I wanted to find out more about healing and because I had these dilemmas, I read the New Testament in 1 month. Just tore through it, looking for anything to answer all these questions I was having, plus how horrible I was feeling. I learned from that dramatical healing should be commonplace according to the Bible, according to the New Testament. It should happen all the time. I learned that the teaching on submission is unwavering, even pacifistic. I learned that the teaching on divorce is uncompromising. And I learned that homosexuality is anathema. These are the things that I believe the Bible taught after reading it. Not that I hadn't heard these things before, but I just needed a fresh read. Well, because I had difficulty reconciling the teaching on healing with my personal experience and the observation I had had over 50 years, I've never really seen any healing that I felt was that dramatic. And because I had difficulty integrating what the Bible taught about submission, divorce, and homosexuality with my real-life clients and what they were going through, and because of my misgivings about the law, the Old Testament, the Torah, I started to wonder, maybe this isn't all true. And it was a terrifying thought. This would be a huge loss to me. My whole life, work, friends, family, etc., was wrapped up in Christianity and the Bible. But I had to settle this once and for all for myself. And I resolved that I would go with the truth wherever it led, whether it was comfortable or not. So I went on a quest. Lasted for about a year. And it was all-consuming. It's basically all I did when I wasn't working was going on this quest to learn. I read a ton. I watched a ton of videos. I listened to podcasts endlessly. I found it interesting. I had the internet now. Back in seminary, when I had these misgivings about my faith and Christianity, there was no internet back then. And it was really difficult to try to get the information that I needed to sort these things out. Now it was very simple. I found out that I could take any cherished belief that I had, add the word debunked after it, and Google would give me a whole bunch of information that I had probably never seen before. For example, Noah's Ark of the Flood, debunked. I started an anonymous blog just for my own purposes called Evangelically Incorrect. This is where I could vent all the things I was going through as I was going through my learning process. It was also a chance to interact with other bloggers who were going through a very similar process. I equated myself with the new atheists such as Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. And I had never heard people talk like this before. It was refreshing in a way, that they were just unapologetic in their critiques of Christianity or the Bible. A couple of channels on YouTube that I want to give a shout out to that really made a lot of difference for me were Dark Matter 2525 and Non-Stamp Collector. These are both animated video channels, but they deal with all the issues in Christianity and the Bible in brilliant ways, in ways that I had not thought of before. And there was also a man on the internet who did a video series about his deconversion, and it resonated a lot with my story. Well, what did I find from all this searching and learning? I want to say that I had 9 pillars that held up my faith. None of them was strong enough to hold up my faith by itself. And I could lose any one of them and I would probably be okay. It's the whole group of the 9 that was what supported my faith. So let's look at each of these 9. The first one was the Bible. The Bible had been the cornerstone of information about my faith from the time I was born. What did I find from my study about the Bible? One, I find it confusing and contradictory. It does not sound a clear call about many things. Next, it was mainly written by unknown authors, even the Gospels by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We don't know who wrote them. The Bible reflects the science and the cosmology of the time that it was written. It doesn't provide anything new or enlightening about science or cosmology. It's what you would expect from Bronze Age people writing at that time. Interestingly, when we were making this PowerPoint, we had written the Bible reflected the science and cosmetology of the time. Thankfully, we caught that and fixed it. Next, there are many places that show that there were more than one version of an event that were woven together. There's 2 flood stories. You can completely separate them, and each one stands completely on its own. But the 2 were woven together and tried to make one story out of it, which is a little bit disjointed and confusing. Next, it always struck me as not odd, but suspicious that it was men, it was people who decided which books would get in the Bible and which books wouldn't get in the Bible. So ultimately, you're hanging your faith about the Bible on what people almost 2,000 years ago decided about, yeah, these books are authoritative and these books aren't. So we're basically as good as their opinion was. I also found that prophecy is riddled with problems. I could go into a long explanation of that, but for example, Isaiah 53 is the suffering servant, which is often related to Jesus, especially around Christmas time. It's not talking about a coming Messiah, it's talking about the nation of Israel. Most events in the Bible have little or no verification in contemporary secular history. We only have the Bible's word for itself. A lot of things are just too fantastic, like the sun standing still for a day. I don't think that happened. The saints came out of their graves and walked around Jerusalem when Jesus died. If that happened, we would have heard about it somewhere else besides the Bible, I think. I came to see that the God in the Bible, the God that's described in the Old Testament, is a monster. As far as I was concerned, he was petty, whiny, controlling, egotistical, jealous, cruel. Nobody would want to worship unless you had to out of fear. If you look at the writings about Jesus in the New Testament chronologically from when they were written, the earliest writings have almost no details about Jesus. It's only until you get to the later writings, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years after the first writings, that they gather more and more details until the last ones have all kinds of details about his life. Our traditional notions of heaven and hell do not appear in the Old Testament. It really was a New Testament invention. The early parts of the Bible definitely paint a polytheistic worldview. Jehovah was not the only God, he was just the chief God. And as I mentioned earlier, the law, or the Torah, to me, was a strange concoction of arcane rules and commandments that could only have been dreamed up by a Bronze Age tribal people. I don't get it. So that's what I came away with about the Bible. The second pillar was creation. I had never seriously studied evolution, or even biology for that matter, so I watched 36 video lectures from Duke University called Biology, the Science of Life. I read a book by Jerry Coyne called Why Evolution is True, which covered geology, genetics, geography, embryology, and human evolution. And I certainly came away believing that an evolutionary explanation was much more plausible than the Genesis 1 and 2 accounts that we have in the Bible, which contradict each other anyway. And I, for one, find evolution to be completely incompatible with evangelical Christianity. If there was no Adam and Eve, if there was no fall, there is no need for redemption, there is no need for Jesus. Third pillar was the resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus is, of course, the unequivocal foundation of Christianity. Without it, Christianity doesn't exist. Paul said in 1 Corinthians, if we have hoped in Christ in this life only, we are of all men to be most pitied. What is the evidence we have of the resurrection? Well, first of all, the only evidence we have is the New Testament writers. We don't have any secular accounts of the event. And the earliest writings about the resurrection were in Paul's letters, where he mentions in no details about Jesus' life. And how did Paul know that Jesus had risen from the dead? He saw him in a vision. Then we have the 4 resurrection accounts in the Gospels, and I believe that they show a myriad of contradictions and differences between each other. They're hopelessly not in sync. What about disciples being martyred for their faith? Certainly nobody would die for a lie. Well, it turns out that pretty much all that is legends and myths and unsubstantiated. One thing that really bothered me is, why did Jesus leave? He lived, he died, he came back from the dead, he was alive, he showed himself to a lot of people. Well, Period. 500 people, it says. But why didn't he stay around? Why did he disappear? It's kind of like somebody saying, hey, this guy was dead and then he came back to life again. Oh, really? Where is he? I'd like to meet him. He disappeared. You have to trust me. In fact, you have to trust me or you'll go to hell. Okay, then. Fourth pillar was prayer. Jesus, if you ask anything in my name, I will do it. All over the New Testament. If you pray 100 times to Jehovah or Jesus, some of those times some freaky things will happen. Just like if you pray 100 times to a milk jug. Sometimes freaky things will happen and it'll seem really coincidental. The other part of the prayer issue is that Christians have developed a whole list of excuses for unanswered prayers. There's no way God could lose. If it happens, God gets the credit. If it doesn't happen, we've got a bunch of reasons why it doesn't happen. Fifth pillar was healing. As I said before, the New Testament adamantly teaches that healing should be commonplace. Many diseases come and go into remission on their own. And most time when people in modern day talk about healing, it's usually some kind of disease like that has periods where it gets better and it gets worse. But when you look at situations that are unambiguous, healing never happens. For example, why doesn't God ever heal amputees? It just never happened, and it never will. Sixth pillar is morality. Where does right and wrong come from? And if we don't have the sense of a God being in charge of morality, then we'll just run loose like wild animals. Well, I didn't have much of a problem with this. I believe that morality is based on societal norms that have developed over hundreds and thousands of years, and as in any species, serve to ensure the survival of the group. I don't think we need a God to explain why we have a concept of right and wrong. Seventh pillar, my personal experience. What about my 2 dramatic conversions? Well, I had read William James' book in seminary called The Varieties of Religious Experience, and I had read James Fowler's book, Stages of Faith, and I knew enough from those books to realize that people go through conversions of various kinds all the time, regardless of what religion they have or what religion they don't have. And so having a conversion experience of some kind is not really an evidence of any particular theological truth. It's more of a psychological reality for that person than it is a specific warrant of that brand of theology. What about the prophecy in the parking lot with the African-American woman? Well, there was really nothing that she said that you'd have to say was definitely from God. And there are some things that she said ended up not coming true at all. And later I learned that she said her accuracy rating was 65%. I was like, if you're going to speak and tell somebody God says such and such, it should be like 100%. 65% doesn't cut it for me. It's kind of like horoscopes. They're vague enough and interesting enough, they kind of seem to apply to everybody. What about getting my job back at New Life when I was so poor? Well, coincidences happen regularly to everybody, and that I was no different in that regard. What about my conversations with God? I believe that they came out of my own mind. I heard the things that I really needed to hear, that I wanted to hear, and some of the direction that I got was tragically wrong. What about speaking in tongues? Well, I was able to speak odd syllables in rapid succession, and I can still do that today. And I don't think it's due to the Holy Spirit at this point. I don't think it served as a prayer language. I don't think that it was used to speak a language that other people could understand, that I couldn't understand. I didn't see any value to it whatsoever. What about my effectiveness in counseling? Well, I've always been sensitive and a good listener. And add to that my tremendous Christian biblical knowledge and my psychological studies and my difficult life experiences helped me to be wise, insightful, compassionate, and encouraging. What about my experience with psychics and mediums and spiritualism? In all my experience with that, nothing really stood out as unexplainable. and nothing foretold the future in any tangible way. Again, it was kind of like horoscopes. Very interesting, and it seemed like it applied to you, but didn't really make any difference in real life. What about pillar number 8, near-death experiences? I had read Raymond Moody's book back in 1975 called Life After Life, which kind of burst open this topic. The problem I have with it is, one, the God figure that people see is the one they're already familiar with. 2, they never seem to come back with any practical information that actually helps us in this real world. And 3, experiences of this type can be imitated by the way of chemicals like ketamine. And 9, what about faith? Christianity puts a huge emphasis on faith. Jesus, after showing Thomas proof that he was alive, said, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who did not see and yet believed." Believing without enough evidence is kind of like a badge of honor in Christianity. But when you think about that for a minute, almost every religion says you have to have some kind of faith to believe in it or to make it work. How are you supposed to know which religion to have faith in? So choosing to have faith in something doesn't help you find truth in any particular way. It just helps something be more acceptable to you. Other things that I learned along the way, Occam's razor. If you got a simple explanation for something and a complicated explanation for something, the simplest one is usually true. And Christians are great at having complicated explanations for a lot of things. Pascal's wager. Pascal said, hey, if you're going to bet that there is a God. Because if you're right, you'll gain a lot and you'll lose little. Well, the problem with that is it makes one susceptible to any religion that has ominous threats attached to it, not just Christianity. Since the severity of the threats are always outweigh whatever supposed benefits would be gotten by not believing. What about the geography of religion? Most religions are tied to particular countries or regions and spread kind of like viruses. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I just mean that's kind of how they spread through contact. What about burden of proof? You claim that there's a God. I don't think there is one. Who's got the burden of proof? Well, I came to believe that the person who claims that there is a God and claims to know who that God is the one that has the burden of proof to prove that. Just because I don't believe in God doesn't mean I have to prove something. And what about unanswered questions? I still don't have answers to many of the big questions of life. But saying God is the answer is meaningless. It doesn't help you understand or get answers any better. Also, if God is the answer, which God? It's okay that we don't have all the answers. It's better to say, I don't know, than to make something up. The problem with apologetics. Lest you think I only dwelt on negative information about the Bible and Christianity, I also took in the best of Christian apologists, such as William Lane Craig. I had already read apologists like Josh McDowell and Francis Schaeffer in the past. Here's the problem I have with apologetics. One, it's an intellectually dishonest pursuit. They start out with a conclusion, and then they try to find supporting evidence for it. They don't go where the evidence leads. 2, a good apologist can explain away or build a case for anything, no matter how ridiculous, just because they're smart. 3, some apologists just love to play logic and word games, and they delight in the minutiae of logical or grammatical technicalities. 4, some apologists have resorted to what is known as presuppositional apologetics. They've given up trying to prove God in the traditional way, and now they say that, well, it would be impossible for us to know anything or have the rules of logic with which to debate unless there was a supernatural being that made these things in order for us to be able to do it. And of course, that being is the Christian God. I see this as Christianity's last gasp in trying to retain the intellectual high ground in what has become a losing battle. And 5, ultimately, many apologists resort to subjective feelings. For example, William Lane Craig says he knows Christianity is true because of the witness of the Holy Spirit in his heart. Interestingly, I heard a Mormon apostle say the exact same thing about his faith. The witness of the Holy Spirit in your heart, or the sense that God is impressing the truth upon your heart, means nothing, because anybody with any belief can claim that. So what was my conclusion of this year of questing? It was traumatic, it was exciting. Traumatic because deeply held and cherished beliefs were ripping apart, and exciting because I was learning so many new things. It was all-consuming. But as I reflected on the 9 pillars that had supported my faith, I had to admit they were pretty much in shambles. Nothing dramatic really happened, which is typically the way deconversion happens, as opposed to conversion. It was just a moment of inner knowing that personally, I could no longer be a Christian and retain my intellectual integrity. It had been wishful thinking after all. I stayed pretty quiet about it for a couple of years. I did have an email group that I had emailed during the depths of my depressions and kept them informed about what was going on in my life. And they knew that I was having struggles with my faith. But I hadn't really come out publicly, so to speak. And where do you come out publicly these days? Facebook, yeah. It was hard for me to leave such an important element of my life out of Facebook. I couldn't talk about it. Whereas Christian people are posting constantly on Facebook, and it's not a problem. So I decided to go bold. On January 1st of last year, 2014, I told my 500 plus Facebook friends, simply indirectly, that I was no longer a Christian. I just don't believe it anymore. Reactions ran the gamut from shock and sadness to accusations that I had never been a true Christian and everything in between. Many people said they would pray for me and that I would come back to my faith. I found it interesting how many people made assumptions about me without having even heard my story. So shortly thereafter, I wrote a short summary of my religious journey. Since then, I've published about a dozen articles on Facebook dealing with various matters of the Christian faith in the Bible. For example, the discrepancies in the order of the days of creation in Genesis 1 and 2, for example. One of the saddest parts to me in this whole endeavor has been that almost every single comment from Christians over this past year and a half has been about me and not about the content that I posted. I would say there's been about 3 times when somebody has actually intelligently engaged with the content that I put on in the article. And that was disappointing to me. What about the future? I have 2 aims for the future. First, I want to continue to educate by disseminating critical information in ways that are accessible to the average person. And second, I want to help people who are struggling with losing their faith. I know that I needed somebody to help me, and that anonymous blog I had was helpful, but I want to be of help to other people. I don't want to force somebody to deconvert. I just want to be available for the emotional trauma that somebody goes through when they're trying to let go of something that's very, very important to them. I have started a Facebook group called Wandering Sheep. It's very small at this point. I haven't really publicized it in any way until today. But I'd love to have you join. If you are an ex-Christian or you're considering leaving the Christian faith, I'd love to have you join. All you need to do is search Wandering Sheep in your Facebook search bar. You'll see the group, and I'll approve you, don't worry. I also intend to publish a book called A Road No Longer Winding. I've written about 100 pages so far. I'd also like to be available to speak to interested groups around the area or around the country, wherever. And I also have an interest in becoming a phone volunteer for something new called the Hotline Project, run by the Recovering from Religion organization. There's a hotline people can call when they are having struggles with their faith. And I will continue to study and learn about topics that are relevant to these pursuits. Thank you so much for staying and listening. I don't think anyone fell asleep. That's awesome. My good friend Trey has videoed the speech tonight because Carrie and Mark couldn't be here, and hopefully we can figure out a way to get that on the First Coast website. It'd be awesome if you could share that link with other people. If you would like a 50-page rough draft of my book, you can email me at douglasrdone@gmail.com, and I will send you a PDF file with it. So that concludes my portion, and now it's up to you to make any comments or raise any questions that you have. And again, I appreciate your patience and your listening.